My name is Adrienne Cole. I'm a trauma nurse. For 9 years, I worked double shifts, paid the bills, rebuilt my husband's credit from the ground up, and loved that man like it was the only thing I knew how to do. Then I came home 4 days early from a nursing conference in London and found my 71-year-old mother locked in our basement, on a cot, in the dark, while another woman slept in my bed upstairs. Derek thought I was still in London. What Derek didn't know was that I'd already seen the bank statements. $31,000. Gone. And that wasn't even the worst of it. He had no idea what I was about to find out. And he had no idea who he'd been sleeping next to for 9 years. Let me tell you how I got here. Before we dive in, comment where you're watching from today. And if stories like this speak to you, hit subscribe, because tomorrow's story is even more intense. I was the kind of woman who set 3 alarms and was up before any of them. That Thursday morning, I had my conference bag packed by 5:15, my scrubs laid out for whenever I'd need them again, and a pot of coffee already cycling. The house was quiet, the way it only gets before Baltimore wakes up. That particular stillness that belongs to nurses and bakers and people with early flights. I moved through it the way I moved through everything, efficiently, without waste, checking each room off a mental list I'd been running for weeks. 2 years of double shifts to fund that conference. Let me put that plainly. 2 years of picking up extra 12-hour stretches at the trauma center, running on bad vending machine coffee, and the specific adrenaline of a woman who had decided she was going to do a thing. The International Nursing Leadership Summit in London was a big deal for a charge nurse from Baltimore. A real credential, the kind that opens doors. I paid for every penny of it myself. Derek had been between solid paychecks for 3 months by then, one of his transitional periods at work that I'd stopped asking about. So I handled it. I always handled it. That was just how we worked. I knocked softly on Mama's door at 5:45. She was already sitting up in bed, which told me she hadn't slept much. Loretta has that way about her. She never makes a fuss about the things that worry her. She just shows them in the set of her shoulders and the stillness of her hands. 8 months since the stroke. 8 months since I'd driven to that hospital in Randallstown and sat with her while the neurologist explained what mild meant and what it didn't. I'd brought her home with us that same week. Derek had stood in the doorway of the guest room and said, "We look after our family." And I had loved him so much in that moment, I could barely find words for it. I sat on the edge of Mama's bed, and she held both my hands in both of hers, the way she used to when I was small, and she was about to tell me something important. "Baby," she said, "I don't know about this." "The flight's only 7 hours, Mama. They serve dinner on the plane." She shook her head just barely. "I know about the flight." I figured she meant the flight. I kissed her forehead, told her Mrs. Pearl was right next door, reminded her that Derek worked from home on Fridays, and made sure her medications were sorted into the weekly organizer on her nightstand. Mama watched me do all of it without saying anything else. When I hugged her goodbye, she held on about 3 seconds longer than usual, and I let her, and then I told myself she was just being a mother about it. You know how it is when you love someone who worries. You learn to reassure them. You don't always stop to ask what, exactly, they're worried about. Derek was at the door with my rolling bag when I came downstairs. Dressed already, which surprised me. He wasn't a morning person under normal circumstances. He looked good. Relaxed, almost. He kissed me and said all the right things. Call when I landed, get some rest on the plane. I deserved this. He was proud of me. He even made a joke about bringing him back something from a proper London bakery. I remember thinking he seemed lighter than he had in months. I should have sat with that longer. Instead, I filed it under work stress finally lifting and wheeled my bag toward the car service idling at the curb. That's when Mrs. Pearl came out of her front door. She was still in her housecoat, which meant she'd been watching for me. My next-door neighbor for 6 years, a woman who had lived on Barlow Street long enough to know every car that didn't belong, flagged me down from her front step like she had something urgent to say, and then thought better of the words. "You call me when you land," she said instead. She held my eyes when she said it. Mrs. Pearl is not a woman who wastes a look. "Yes, ma'am," I said. She nodded once, slow, went back inside. I got in the car. The driver pulled away from the curb and I watched the house through the rear window. The brick front, the white trim I'd repainted 2 summers ago, Loretta's curtain shifting in the upstairs window. Derek had already gone inside. The door was closed. I told myself I was being paranoid. Mama was fine. Derek was fine. I'd be back in 2 weeks. I had a conference bag full of presentation materials and a hotel room in Kensington and a whole career waiting for the next chapter I was about to write for it. Everything would be exactly as I left it. I was so wrong about that last part. 4 days into London, the conference was everything I'd worked for. The sessions ran long, and I didn't mind. I was in a room with 200 nurses from 6 countries, talking about systems and leadership and the kind of structural change that actually saves lives. I was taking notes by hand because I retain things better that way. I was present. I was good. And then I tried to call Mama on the 4th evening and got nothing. Not voicemail, just ringing. 8, 9, 10 times, and then silence. I told myself the time difference. I told myself she'd fallen asleep early. I set my phone on the nightstand and went back to my session notes, and didn't sleep well. The next morning I tried again. Nothing. I texted Derek. He replied 40 minutes later. "She's tired. Been resting a lot. Don't worry." 3 words shorter than his usual texts. I noticed that, the way I notice a patient's breathing pattern shift. Not alarmed yet, just registering, logging it. I called him that evening. He picked up on the 4th ring, which was 2 rings later than usual. "She's fine, Adrian. You know how she gets when her routine changes. She's just not feeling social." Not feeling social. That's the phrase that sat wrong. Loretta has never, in her 71 years on this earth, been not feeling social. That woman will talk to a cashier for 20 minutes about the weather and mean every word of it. "Let me talk to her," I said. "She's sleeping." "Derek, it's 2 in the afternoon there." "She napped late. Adrian, come on. You're in London. Enjoy it. She's fine." I let it go. For about 6 hours, I let it go. Then I opened my laptop and booked an earlier flight home. I didn't tell him. That was a deliberate choice, and I knew it was the moment I made it. I'm a nurse. I read situations for a living. I know the difference between someone telling me a patient is stable and someone managing what I'm allowed to know about a patient. Derek was managing me. And the thing about being managed is that the moment you announce you've caught on, the information stops. So I said nothing. I packed my bag that night, apologized to the conference coordinator the next morning, and got myself to Heathrow. 7 hours over the Atlantic is a long time to be alone with your own thoughts. You know what I did with those 7 hours? I went through my marriage like a woman auditing a budget she should have checked sooner. Not angry, not dramatic, just methodical, just honest. The fertility treatments, 2 rounds, neither of which worked, both of which I funded because Derek's insurance through his then-employer didn't cover them, and mine did. $18,000 over 14 months. I don't say that to keep score. I say it because it happened, and because I carried it quietly, and because I told myself that's what you do when you love someone and you're building something together. The car note, 18 months of payments on a vehicle in his name because his credit score was too damaged from before we married to qualify for a reasonable rate. And we needed him mobile for the sales territory. I made every payment on time. His score recovered. I was glad for it. There was a morning I still think about sometimes. Loretta at her old kitchen table in Randallstown, sewing the hem on my nursing school graduation dress at 11 o'clock at night because I'd grown a ½ inch since she'd started it, and she wanted the hem to be right. The soft hiss of the iron, her reading glasses sliding down her nose. She never complained, not once. That's where I learned what it looks like to love someone through the inconvenient parts. I'd tried to do that in my marriage, I'd believed I was. Somewhere over the middle of the ocean, I almost talked myself into landing at Heathrow, turning around, going back. I catalogued every reason I was probably wrong. Derek loved me. He was stressed, not scheming. Mama was 71 and recovering, and maybe she really was just tired. Maybe I was a woman who worked in emergency medicine and therefore looked for emergencies that weren't there. Maybe. I didn't change the flight. Because here's the thing about instinct. The clinical kind. The kind you build over a decade of reading people in crisis. It doesn't perform. It doesn't catastrophize. It just identifies the gap between what you're being told and what the information actually shows, and it holds that gap open and says, "Look again." I looked again. Every version of Derek's explanation had one thing in common. I couldn't verify any of it. The wheels touched down at BWI at 6:03 in the morning on a Thursday. The terminal was gray and quiet, early shift workers moving through it with the particular efficiency of people who've been awake since 4. I collected my bag. I did not call Derek. I did not text him. I hailed a car to Barlow Street the same way I'd left it. From the curb, no announcement, nothing ahead of me but the ride. Mama still hadn't answered a single call. The key still worked. I remember being almost surprised by that. I let myself in through the front door and stood in the entryway for 3 seconds before I understood that something was off. Not dramatically off, not ransacked, just shifted. The way a room looks when someone has been living in it who doesn't know where things belong. Loretta's reading chair had moved 2 feet toward the window. The side table was gone from the hall. Small wrongnesses, the kind you only catch when you know a space down to the grain of it. I set my bag down quietly. The dining room was next. A coat was draped over the back of one chair. Camel-colored wool, belted, a size smaller than anything I owned. Not my coat. I looked at it for a long moment. I didn't touch it. Upstairs. I moved without making noise, which I didn't decide to do. It just happened. The body going careful before the mind catches up. The master bedroom door was closed. I opened it. The bed was made, but not the way I make it. Perfume in the air, something floral and young. A charger on Derek's nightstand. A second charger on mine. I closed that door. Loretta's room was 3 steps down the hall. I already knew before I opened it. The dresser was gone. Her Bible, her pill organizer, her small framed photo of my father. All of it gone. The room was empty except for the faint smell of her lotion still caught in the curtains. My hands didn't shake yet. I want to be clear about that. I was still running on something colder than feeling. I went downstairs, and that's when I saw the basement door. There's always been a basic push handle on that door. I've opened it 1,000 times to do laundry, to get the extra folding chairs, to swap out the seasonal storage. But someone had installed a sliding bolt, heavy gauge, surface mounted, the kind you buy at a hardware store, on the outside of the door. The screws were still bright, hadn't had time to dull. My hands went still. I slid the bolt. The door opened onto darkness and warm, stale air, and I reached for the light switch and hit it, and there was my mother. She was on a cot, a camping cot, the kind with aluminum legs, wearing her housecoat and one slipper, and she was blinking up at me like a woman surfacing from very deep water. A TV tray beside her with a plate on it that I did not look at directly. No phone, no book. Just the cot and the tray and the single bulb overhead, and my 71-year-old mother, who had a stroke 8 months ago, looking at me like she wasn't sure I was real. "Baby," she said. That was the whole word, just that. I got her upstairs. I got her water. I found the blanket from the hall closet and wrapped it around her shoulders, and sat her on the couch and crouched in front of her while she drank, and I watched her color come back by degrees, and my hands had stopped shaking because they had gone somewhere past shaking into something quieter and more permanent. I waited until she'd finished the water. Then I asked the only question that mattered right then. How long? She looked at her hands. "Third day you were gone," she said. "He moved her in, called her Renee." Renee. The name landed the way a splinter lands, small, clean, immediate, something I'd be finding the edges of for a long time. Loretta looked up at me then. "I told him to call you. He took my phone, baby. He said you were busy." I didn't move. I didn't speak. I just held what she'd said inside my chest for one breath, and then I stood up and said, "Okay, come on." I walked her out the front door, down the porch steps, across the small stretch of concrete sidewalk to the house next door. I lifted my hand to knock on Mrs. Pearl's door, and it opened before my knuckles made contact. Mrs. Pearl, my neighbor of 11 years, small, gray-haired, wearing a housecoat of her own, and looking not the least bit surprised to see me, stood in the doorway and said, "I've been waiting for you to come back." She stepped aside to let Loretta in first. Then she looked at me directly, the way a woman looks at another woman when they both already know the shape of the thing. "That car's been on this street since the day after you left," she said. "Dark blue sedan. She was in your house by nightfall on day 3. I heard things through the wall, Adrian. I didn't know how to reach you without him finding out. So I waited." She paused. "I knew you'd come home." I stood on Mrs. Pearl's porch for exactly 30 seconds after the door closed behind me. I didn't go back inside. I didn't cross the street. I didn't march up my own front steps and start swinging doors open looking for Derek or Renee or answers or any of it. I had 11 years of nursing behind me, and the first thing they teach you in a trauma bay, the thing they say until it becomes reflex, is that you do not move until you know where the bleeding is. I got in my car, and I drove 3 blocks to the Gulf Station on Pratt. There's a payphone on the side wall there, between the air pump and a bulletin board with lost cat flyers going soft in the weather. I don't know if you've used a payphone recently, but I want you to understand that my choosing it over my cell phone was not nostalgia. Derek knew my number. I wasn't ready for him to know I was home. I called my older cousin, Deja Washington, a paralegal at a Baltimore family law firm, Collect. She picked up on the second ring. I talked. She listened without interrupting, which is a skill most people don't have, and Deja has completely. I told her about the bolt on the basement door, the cot, Mama's condition, the coat over the chair, the name Renee. When I finished, Deja was quiet for 3 seconds. Then she said, "Okay, I've seen this before. Here's what you're going to do." 3 things. She gave me 3 things, and she said them like she was reading from a list she'd already written. Don't touch anything in that house. Document everything. Do not let Derek know you're back yet. That was it. I asked her why the third one mattered as much as the first 2, and she said, "Because the one who moves first loses. You've already been moved on. Don't you move until you can win." I held that payphone receiver and felt something settle in my chest like ballast. "Call me from this number when you have what you need," she said. "I'll have an attorney ready." The next 48 hours, I moved through that house like a woman doing inventory. I went in each time through the back door, my spare key from the emergency box under the porch step. During the hours Derek was at work. Renee wasn't there in the mornings. Whatever arrangement they had, she apparently wasn't living there around the clock, just enough to make her presence felt in every room. I photographed the bolt first, close with something for scale, a quarter from my pocket, flat against the bright screws. Then the cot in the basement, still set up, the TV tray with the plate. Then Loretta's condition, documented at Mrs. Pearl's kitchen table with a timestamp on every shot. The disorientation in her eyes those first hours, the bruising at her ankle where the cot frame had caught her, the dehydration still visible in her lips and hands. I photographed the master bedroom, Renee's charger, Renee's shoes lined up beneath the window, Renee's moisturizer on my dresser with my things pushed to the side. I stood in that doorway and looked at it all without stepping in. You know what I didn't do? I didn't throw a single thing. I didn't move a single thing. I took 47 photographs and I left every object exactly where I found it. I remember my mother ironing the blouse she wore to my nursing school pinning ceremony, standing at the board for 40 minutes getting the sleeves right because she said a woman should look pressed when she steps into her calling. That kind of precision was hers first. I learned it from watching her hands. Derek's desk was in the second bedroom he used as a home office, and that's where I found the folder. It wasn't hidden. It was just a manila folder, rubber-banded, sitting under a cable invoice on the left side of the desk. The kind of thing you don't bother to conceal when you believe no one with any authority to act on it is ever going to open it. I opened it. Joint account statements, 7 months of them. I read each page twice with the kind of attention I give to a medication chart, and what I found was this: $31,000, withdrawn in cash across 32 separate transactions, never more than 1,000 at a time, spread out enough to feel like nothing, a slow drain dressed up as ordinary spending. There was a lease tucked behind the statements, an apartment on the east side of the city, signed by Derek, co-signed by a Renee Tate, 6 months ago. She had signed that lease 6 months ago. That apartment had been running on Derek's portion of our joint savings for half a year. She knew where the money came from. She cashed every arrangement that money bought while I was at the hospital, running 12-hour shifts and coming home too tired to notice the account was bleeding out. I photographed every page of the folder. That afternoon, I sat in my car outside Mrs. Pearl's house with the folder on the passenger seat. I opened it one more time, looked at every number, every date, looked at Renee Tate's signature on that lease. Neat, unhurried, the handwriting of a woman who had not been afraid. I closed the folder. I started the engine. The following morning, I got up before sunrise, crossed back into my own house, and made coffee. Not because I needed the coffee, because it was my kitchen. I stood at the counter and listened to the house breathe around me. The refrigerator hum, the radiator tick, the particular creak of the third stair that had needed fixing since year 2 of our marriage. I knew every sound that house made. Derek was still upstairs when the pot finished brewing. I poured 1 cup. I waited. He came down at 7:12. I heard him reach the landing, heard his step hesitate, heard the specific silence of a man whose brain had just caught up with what his eyes were seeing. I didn't turn around. Adrian. I turned then, slowly, cup in both hands. He looked the way men look when the story they've been telling themselves gets interrupted. Not guilty, not yet, just recalibrating. He ran a hand across the back of his neck, and his face assembled itself into something that was supposed to read as relieved. Hey, when did you get back? Why didn't you call me? I would have picked you up, you know I would have. How's Loretta? I said. The recalibration flickered. She's fine. She was being difficult, Adrian, I'm telling you. She wouldn't cooperate, she kept… Difficult. It was temporary. The whole thing was temporary. It just got out of hand. And I know how it looks, but it was temporary, I said again. He heard what I was doing. He shifted to charm, the smile, the step toward me, the lowered voice that used to work before I understood what it was for. Baby, look, Renee is nobody. She's absolutely nobody. She was a mistake, I know that. And I know I know you're hurt, and you have every right to be. But if you'll just let me explain. Let me tell you something about a woman who has spent 11 years absorbing explanations. She knows when she's being managed. I set my cup down. I walked to the counter beside the desk, where I'd left the folder that morning. I took out 1 bank statement, just one, the most recent, and I placed it on the counter between us, face up. He looked at it, looked at me. He reached for it. Don't. The word came out flat and final, and my hand went still at my side. He pulled his hand back. The charm dropped. You went through my desk. You went through my personal, our account. You know what your problem is? His voice climbed now, and there it was, the thing under the charm, the thing that had been building for however long he'd been building it. You have been cold, Adrian, for years. You walk through this house like it's a job, like we're just 2 more items on your shift checklist. You never once made me feel like I mattered to you more than that hospital did. I picked up my keys from the counter. I chose this house, I said. I paid for it. He was still talking when I walked out the front door. That same evening, Deja called. I was parked outside Mrs. Pearl's house, windows cracked, the folder on my lap. She'd spent the day pulling county records, and I could hear the particular quiet in her voice that I'd learned meant she'd found something. He refinanced the house, she said. 6 months ago. He pulled equity and restructured the note. My hands went still on the folder. He added Renee Tate as a co-borrower. I didn't say anything. Your name is still on the deed, Deja said. He couldn't remove that without your signature, and he knew it. But what he could do, what he was trying to do, was establish her on the loan, build a paper argument for shared financial interest in the property, and use that as leverage in a forced buyout. He was going to come to you eventually with a number, walk away from the house, or fight it in court.
His bet was you'd take the number. Renee Tate had signed those documents. She'd put her name on a mortgage for a house that had my name on the deed. She knew exactly whose name was already there. She signed anyway. That wasn't a woman who got swept into something she didn't understand. That was a woman who sat down at a table, reviewed the paperwork, and made a choice. Deja told me to drive to her law office. She had someone she wanted me to meet. I pulled out from the curb and drove the 12 minutes across town without the radio, without a call, without a single word spoken in that car. I parked in the lot behind the building and sat there for a moment in the dark. It hadn't been passion. It hadn't been loneliness, or weakness, or some collision of bad timing and worse judgment. It had been a plan. A coordinated, documented, patiently executed plan to move me out of my own life. And both of them had worked on it together, in my house, with my money, while I was 50 blocks away keeping strangers alive. I picked up the folder. I got out of the car. The next morning, I was in Deja's office at 8:15. My older cousin, Deja Washington, a paralegal at a Baltimore family law firm, met me at the door with 2 coffees and no small talk. That was how I knew she understood the weight of what we were doing. She walked me straight back to a corner office and introduced me to her colleague, a family law attorney who had been practicing in Baltimore for 22 years. He shook my hand and didn't waste time on sympathy. I respected that immediately. We were filing by 9:45. Divorce petition, fraud claim with the mortgage lender, co-borrower signature obtained on a property with a non-consenting co-owner of record. My attorney explained the lender's exposure in plain terms, and I watched him write the language that would freeze that refinance like a hand around a throat. Quiet. Effective. Done. You know what nobody tells you about the paperwork side of ending a marriage? It doesn't feel like grief. It feels like surgery. You locate the damage, you work clean, and you close. From the law office, I drove to my bank and opened a new account in my name only. Adrian Cole. No joint holder, no secondary access, no exceptions. I sat across from the branch manager, a young woman who moved efficiently through the forms without asking questions she didn't need answers to, and I redirected my direct deposit before I stood up from that chair. 9 years of my paycheck going into a shared account. Done in 11 minutes. Then I drove to the 2nd District Station and filed the elder abuse report. I brought everything. The photographs of the bolt, close enough to show the screws were new. The photograph of the cot. The TV tray. The timestamps on every image. Loretta's written statement, which she'd given me 2 days earlier in Mrs. Pearl's kitchen. Hands steady, words clear, every fact in order. My mother was a woman who had always known how to make something precise and lasting with her hands. Even her testimony was stitched tight.
The officer who took the report read it without expression. When he finished, he looked up and said the case would be forwarded to the Elder Abuse Unit for follow-up. I gave him my attorney's card. I gave him Loretta's doctor's name. Speaking of which, I called Loretta's doctor from the parking lot before I left. I needed a formal medical record of her condition at time of discovery, the dehydration, the disorientation, the physical markers of what 11 days without adequate care had done to a 71-year-old stroke survivor. Her doctor was thorough and appropriately angry. She scheduled Loretta for an evaluation that same week and told me the clinical notes would support the report. I thanked her and hung up. That memory came back to me then, uninvited. Mama at her machine the winter I was 12, running a hem at 11 o'clock at night because a client needed a dress by morning, never once complaining, just humming low under the needle noise. She had given everything she had to people who needed it. She deserved better than a cot in a basement. She deserved better than what Derek Cole decided she was worth. My jaw tightened. I put the car in drive. I got back to the hospital at 2 to finish a half shift I'd already committed to. I was 20 minutes into it when Tamara, a veteran ER nurse who had worked that unit longer than anyone on the floor, fell into step beside me in the hallway. "Hey," she said. "You doing okay? You've seemed, I don't know, focused." "Always am," I said. She nodded, then, "Actually, I've been meaning to tell you something. Didn't know if it was worth bringing up." She lowered her voice just slightly. "About 2 months ago, a woman came to the front desk. Young, professional-looking, nice coat. She asked whether Nurse Cole was on shift that day. Not your first name, your title and your last name, exactly like that." My hands went still on the chart I was holding. "I happened to be walking by," Tamara said. "I didn't think much of it at the time, figured it was a patient's family member or something. But the way she was asking, like she was confirming a schedule, not looking for help, it stuck with me. I described her to one of the front desk clerks last week, and they remembered her too." I asked her to describe the woman. She did. Late 20s, medium height, natural hair pulled back, a gray wool coat with big buttons. I had seen that coat. It had been draped over my dining chair. Renee Tate had stood in the lobby of my hospital. She had confirmed I was on shift. She had walked back out, gotten in her car, and used that information to coordinate the timeline, to guarantee I was 50 blocks away before she or Derek made their next move at the house. She hadn't stumbled into my life. She had scouted it. I thanked Tamara. I finished my shift. I drove home. That evening, I parked in front of the house on Barlow Street and sat for a moment, with both hands in my lap. Every filing was complete. Every account was secured. Every record had been established, documented, and submitted to the appropriate authority. Derek's car was in the driveway. He was inside. I had nothing left to prepare. I got out of the car and walked to my front door. Saturday morning came in gray and cold, the kind of November quiet that makes everything feel suspended. I was up before 6. I made 1 pot of coffee, set out 3 mugs, and laid every document on the kitchen table in the order I intended to present them. I didn't rehearse what I was going to say. I already knew. Deja arrived at 7:30. She came in through the front door, which I'd left unlocked for her, and she didn't say anything when she saw the table. She just pulled out a chair on the far side, sat down, and wrapped both hands around her mug. Her presence was enough. It always had been. Derek's mother, Harriet, arrived at 8. I'd called her 2 days earlier and asked her to come to the house Saturday morning. I told her it was important. I told her she deserved to hear what her son had done directly, not through a phone call 6 months from now when the story had already been smoothed over and revised. She'd been quiet on the phone for a long moment. Then she said, "I'll be there." Harriet was a woman who had always respected me, not in the soft way people perform respect, in the way that means something. She showed up on time. Derek came downstairs at 8:15 and stopped cold in the kitchen doorway. He looked at his mother first, then at Deja, then at the table, then at me. "Adrian, sit down," I said. He sat. I started with the bank statements. I laid them out one by one, 7 months of withdrawals, each one dated, each one circled in blue ink. $31,000. I didn't explain them. I let him look. Then the lease, his signature, Renee Tate's name, the apartment across town, the monthly amount, his contribution, underlined once. Then the mortgage documents, the refinance he'd filed 6 months ago, her name added as co-borrower, my name still on the deed he hadn't gotten around to removing. I set that page directly in front of him and watched him read it like he was seeing it for the first time, which was a performance I found insulting. Then the elder abuse filing, the photographs, the bolt, the cot, the TV tray, the timestamp in the corner of every frame. Then the hospital record, Loretta's condition at time of discovery, documented by her physician, signed, dated. Then the last page, Tamara's written account of the woman in the gray wool coat who came to the front desk of my hospital and asked, by title and last name, whether I was on shift. I set that one down last, and then I stepped back and let the table speak. You know what a guilty man sounds like when he finally runs out of road? He sounds like every other guilty man. They all reach for the same 3 doors. Derek tried remorse first. He said he was sorry, said he hadn't meant for it to go this far, said things had gotten out of hand and he'd been trying to figure out how to fix it. His voice did that thing, that careful, practiced dip into sincerity that used to move me. My hands stayed flat on the counter behind me. Then he tried rage, said I was never home, said I treated the marriage like a job and him like a dependent, said Loretta coming to live with us had changed everything, like that was a thing a man says out loud and expects to be forgiven for. He got loud. I waited. Then the tears. His jaw trembled. He said he still loved me, said he'd made mistakes but he wasn't a bad person, said I was making him look like a monster when the truth was complicated. You locked a stroke survivor in a basement, I said, so your girlfriend could sleep in my bed. I kept my voice level. You don't get to tell me who I am. The kitchen went absolutely still. He turned to his mother then, that last instinct of a man who has always been able to look left and find someone willing to soften the landing. Mama, just let me explain. Harriet, who had not moved from her chair in the corner, who had sat through every document and every word without a visible reaction, looked at her son for a long moment. Then she said, Derek, stop talking. He stopped. I slid the divorce papers across the table, already filed, already received, already a matter of record in Baltimore City. I told him he had 30 days to vacate the property. The fraud filing had frozen the refinance. My attorney had confirmed it 2 days prior. The house was mine. It had always been mine. Now the paperwork said so clearly enough that no one could pretend otherwise. Derek stood up slowly. He didn't look at me again. He walked out of the kitchen. I heard his footsteps on the stairs, the sound of a door closing. Not slamming, just closing, like even his anger had run out of fuel. I turned to the counter. I took a glass from the cabinet and filled it with water from the tap. I drank it standing there, in my kitchen, in the quiet. Behind me, I heard Harriet's chair push back. Her footsteps moved toward the front of the house. The door opened, and then it closed. And then there was nothing but the sound of the faucet I hadn't fully turned off, and the low, indifferent hum of the refrigerator. He walked out of that kitchen looking 10 years older. I looked like myself for the first time in months. Derek was gone in 18 days. He didn't use all 30. I think staying in that house, under that ceiling, with those documents filed and that silence between us, became something he couldn't sustain. I don't know where he went first. I didn't ask. I came home from a shift on a Tuesday evening and found his closet empty, his toiletries cleared from the bathroom, and a house key sitting on the kitchen counter like a period at the end of a sentence he'd already forgotten he started. I called a locksmith that same afternoon. watched him rekey every door from the front porch while the November air came off the street, cold and clean. New locks, new keys, new combinations. The locksmith handed me 2 sets, and I put both in my coat pocket and stood there for a moment after he drove away. Just stood there on my own front steps. That was all I needed. Let me tell you something about consequences. People imagine them as explosions, some big public moment where everything caves in at once, and the people who wronged you get to feel it all in one sharp, dramatic dose. That's not how it works. Real consequences are quiet. They accumulate. They find you in the small places: the unanswered call, the termination letter, the lease you can't renew. They don't announce themselves. They just arrive, one after the other, until the weight of them is undeniable. That's exactly what happened. The elder abuse charge was filed and processed and became a matter of public record in Baltimore City. A misdemeanor, not nothing. The kind of thing that shows up when someone searches your name and starts asking questions. Derek's employer ran exactly that search when the department head received a call from my attorney's office. He was placed on administrative leave pending a code of conduct review within the week. His company had a morality clause. He'd signed it. He'd simply never imagined it would apply to him. Harriet stopped returning his calls. I heard that through the family, eventually. I didn't reach out to her. She didn't owe me an explanation, and I didn't need one. She'd been in that kitchen. She'd seen every page. Some doors, once opened, don't close the same way twice. The mortgage fraud investigation moved more slowly, the way financial proceedings do. Methodical, paper-heavy, and thorough. My attorney kept me updated in plain terms. Derek's ability to refinance, co-sign, or leverage any property was frozen for years. The refinance he'd tried to push through, the one with Renee Tate's signature on the co-borrower line, was unwound by the lender's fraud unit inside of 6 weeks. That transaction never happened. The house remained exactly what it had always been. Mine. Renee's situation was its own separate matter. Because she'd signed mortgage documents on a property with a living co-owner who had not consented, the lender's investigation carried a criminal referral. Felony mortgage fraud. She hired an attorney, of course, and plea bargained it down to a reduced charge. Smart move, practically speaking. But reduced is not erased. What remained attached to her name was enough to survive every background check she would ever face for the foreseeable future. Renee worked in healthcare administration. That field runs background checks without exception and without sentiment. She was let go quietly, the way institutions let people go when they want the problem to disappear without the noise of a formal hearing. No severance worth mentioning, from what I understood. No recommendation she could use. And without Derek's finances behind it, the apartment across town folded. The lease he'd co-signed, funded by $31,000 he'd pulled out of our joint account, collapsed the moment his accounts were frozen and his income was under review. She lost it. She sent me a text. One text from a number I didn't have saved but recognized by the area code and the timing. I read it standing at the kitchen counter. It was long, the kind of long that comes from desperation dressed up as explanation. She said things I won't repeat because they don't deserve the repetition. She wanted me to understand her side. She wanted something from me. Acknowledgement, maybe. Or reaction. Some proof that she'd mattered enough to draw one. I put my phone face down on the counter. I never replied. You want to know the honest reason? Renee Tate was never a person in my story. She was a tool in someone else's plan. And when the plan collapsed, so did her relevance. I don't argue with tools. I don't respond to them. I simply set them down and move on. The following Monday, I drove to the trauma center the way I'd driven there 1,000 times before. Same route, same parking structure, same badge swipe at the main entrance. The unit was loud in the way it always was at shift change. Monitors, voices, the flat, efficient sound of a floor in motion. The night nurse handed me the report clipboard. I took it, read it standing up, the way I always did, already sorting by priority. Around me the unit moved. Orderlies, residents, the pharmacy cart rounding the far corner. I was exactly where I belonged. Several weeks after Derek left, I stood in the upstairs guest room with a measuring tape in one hand and a notepad in the other. The room had been a storage space more than anything else, a bed nobody slept in, boxes we never unpacked, Derek's old golf clubs leaning in the corner collecting dust. I'd already moved the boxes to the curb, the clubs too. I pulled the tape from wall to wall and wrote down the numbers and stood in the middle of the empty floor for a moment, just to feel the space. This was going to be Mama's room. Not the room she slept in, the room that was hers. You know what it costs a woman to be useful her whole life and never once get a room of her own? I knew. I'd watched it. I remembered the way she used to sew at the kitchen table when I was small. The portable machine pushed to one end, her patterns spread across the other, fabric pooling over the edge and onto the floor. She never complained about the space, she just worked with what she had, the way she always did. That memory of her bent over a seam at midnight, squinting under the overhead light because the table lamp had burned out and she hadn't gotten around to replacing the bulb. I let it sit with me for one moment. Then I put my pen to the notepad and started the list. Proper overhead lighting, the kind that didn't strain your eyes. A window treatment that let in the morning light but cut the afternoon glare. Shelving, real shelving, not the wire utility rack from the garage. And a machine. A good one, not the machine she'd been nursing along for 15 years with a replaced foot pedal and a bobbin that jammed if you looked at it wrong. I took Mama to the fabric store on a Saturday, and I told her to pick whatever colors she wanted. She stood in the aisle for a long time, touching bolts of cotton and linen and a length of deep gold that caught the light. She filled the cart slowly, deliberately, the way someone fills a cart when they're not used to being told yes without conditions. She picked a deep teal, a warm ivory, that gold. A soft coral she held up to the window to check the color in natural light. I didn't rush her once. 3 weeks later, the room was done. Mama stood in the doorway the first morning and didn't say anything for a moment. The new machine sat on a proper cutting table under the window. The shelves held her fabric in neat, folded stacks. Teal, ivory, gold, coral, a few others she'd added since. The light was good. The room was warm. It smelled like new wood and pressed cotton. She said, "Baby." Just that. And then she walked in and sat down at the machine and ran her hand along the top of it. And that was enough for both of us. Her health steadied in the weeks after. Regular meals helped. Her own space helped more. The fear leaving, that helped most of all. A body that has been carrying tension for weeks doesn't release it all at once, but it releases it. Her color came back. Her appetite evened out. Her doctor was pleased at the follow-up. Mrs. Pearl, my neighbor who'd kept Mama safe that first terrible morning, came by most mornings now with coffee and enough opinions about whatever was on the news to fill an hour. I'd hear them in the kitchen sometimes when I was getting ready for a shift. 2 older women talking over each other and laughing, and the sound of it moved through the house like something that had always been there and had only just been let back in. Deja, my older cousin and the woman who'd handed me the blueprint for every right move I made, stopped in on weekends. She'd sit at the kitchen table with her laptop, and I'd sit across from her with mine, and we'd work in the same comfortable quiet that we'd had since we were teenagers, doing homework in her mother's living room. The house felt different, lighter, like something that had been pressed down had been allowed to rise. The promotion paperwork came on a Thursday. Nursing supervisor, effective the following pay period. I'd interviewed for the position before London, back when everything in the house still looked the way it was supposed to. The offer letter had my name at the top and my title at the bottom and a salary line that I read twice. I sat at the kitchen table and signed it. From down the hall I could hear Mama's machine running, the steady, even rhythm of it, the sound I'd grown up falling asleep to. Then the machine stopped for a moment, and in the quiet she started humming, something low and old, a song I half recognized from childhood without being able to name it. I set the pen down. I didn't move to the refrigerator right away. I just sat there with the signed paper in front of me and listened to her hum, and the house held the sound the way a house holds warmth, from the inside out. Then I got up, walked to the refrigerator, and pinned the paperwork to the door. 14 months after that Saturday morning in the kitchen, I pulled on my coat and walked to the mailbox in the November cold. Nothing dramatic about it. Bills, a catalog Mama had ordered from, something from my insurance company, and then an envelope underneath all of it, handwritten, with a return address I recognized without wanting to. Derek's handwriting. Still the same. I stood at the mailbox and opened it right there. I don't know why. Maybe because I wanted to read it in the cold, where nothing feels too warm or too close. The letter was 2 pages. Careful, measured language. The kind a man uses when he's had time to rehearse. He said he'd been doing some thinking. Said he knew he'd made mistakes. Said he wasn't looking to cause trouble, just wondering if there was any chance we could sit down and talk. He used the word closure twice. You know what closure looks like to a man who got away with less than he planned? It looks like one more conversation where he gets to explain himself to someone who used to love him. I read it through to the end. My hands were steady. The cold didn't bother me. What I felt was not rage. It wasn't grief either. That had already done its work and moved on, the way grief does when you're too busy rebuilding to indulge it. What I felt, standing there at that mailbox in November, was something closer to nothing. The way you feel when you check the weather and it says exactly what you expected. Noted. Filed. Moving on. I folded the letter back into the envelope, tucked it under my arm with the rest of the mail, and walked inside. The house was warm. It always was now, not just the temperature, but the quality of it. The specific warmth of a place that has the right people in it. I set the mail on the counter. Derek's envelope went on the far end, away from the rest, not because it upset me, but because I didn't want it mixed in with things that mattered. I poured myself a coffee and sat down at the kitchen table. The letter sat on the counter across the room. I looked at it once. I thought about all the versions of me that might have answered it. The version from 9 years ago who believed in the man she married. The version from 2 years ago who was still funding his credit score and calling it love. Neither of those women lived here anymore. I didn't draft a reply. There was nothing to say that the divorce papers hadn't already said cleaner. My hospital ID hung by the front door on the hook where I always left it. A. Cole, RN, Supervisor. I'd had it reprinted 3 times just because I liked seeing the title there. That's the truth. I'm not ashamed of it. That title wasn't given to me. I built the career that made it inevitable. Then I cleared out everything that had been slowing the build down, and I let the work speak without interference. Let me tell you something about a woman who's been quiet too long. When she finally stops arranging her life around people who don't deserve the effort, when she redirects all that capacity toward herself, what she builds is something no one can take a co-borrower stake in. I drank my coffee. I didn't think about Derek again. From the back of the house, coming down the hall in that way that fills a space gradually, like light through a cracked door, Mama's voice. Something low and old. A hymn maybe, or something that predated hymns. The kind of song that gets passed down without a title, woman to woman, generation to generation, until no one can remember where it started, just that it always was. I set my mug down. I walked to the doorway of the sewing room. Mama was at her machine in the morning light, a length of that deep gold cotton running under the presser foot. She hadn't heard me come down the hall. She was just singing, quiet and easy, the way you sing when you're not performing it for anyone, when the sound is just something your body does because it's comfortable enough to. Her hands moved the fabric, steady and sure. The shelves behind her held her colors, the teal, the ivory, the coral. The window caught the low November sun and spread it across the cutting table in a long, pale bar. She didn't notice me standing there. I didn't say anything. I just stood in the doorway with my shoulder against the frame and let the sound move through the house, through the hallway and into the kitchen, into every room that used to hold something wrong and now just held us. It sounded like mine, this house, this morning, this life. I decided then that it always had been. Thank you for watching until the end. If this story meant something to you, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. I've got 2 stories on the screen that you have to watch next. Have a great day.